How do I move this forward?
Yes.
Sorry.
Sorry, Lex. Yeah, the clicker doesn't work, so it's the right arrow to go forward, back arrow to go back, and if you want to turn the screen off, just hit B for black.
Okay, so this is forward. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, a pleasure to be here and to have been invited to this workshop and to discuss complexity. As said, I'm an economist, so I'm approaching the issue from the economic side, but I do think it has wider meaning. The financial crisis, the recent financial crisis, can be seen as a wake-up call, or should be seen as a wake-up call for monetary theory, for finance, macroeconomics, and economics more generally. Not because the timing could not be predicted, but because analyzing, describing financial stability and instability is difficult, if not impossible, in a framework where money and finance have no proper foundation, have no proper place, as is the case, I will argue, in current mainstream economics. And all this, ironically, is against the background of what I call the great financial expansion of the past 4 or 5 decades. And the great financial expansion is a phenomenon that we have seen an enormous growth of financial variables of the financial system relative to the real economy of the production of goods and services. And this great financial expansion has probably fundamentally changed the way the economy and the financial system works. And that cannot be understood without understanding money and finance in the system. And again, that cannot be done in a framework in which money and finance are inessential, are a sideshow. And in the mainstream framework, money and finance do not matter for the longer-term outcome of the economic process. They do not matter in explaining the fundamental outcome of the economic process. So what's the problem in mainstream economics? There are 2 core assumptions, I will argue, that are problematic. And both of them are related to the knowledge of economic agents in the system, and then also related to economics itself. And the first one has to do with the uncertainty about the future. And the second one with the dispersion of knowledge and information across the system, heterogeneity or complexity of the financial system. And all these expressions are, let's say, are sides of the same coin in the end. So what I will argue is that taking into account uncertainty and complexity implies a different paradigm for economics. It implies a different methodology. It implies a different pretense of what economic theory can achieve. It implies a different concept of economic policy and what it can achieve. It has its own language and concepts which are different from mainstream economics. Now this new paradigm need not be built up from scratch. It can be built, and to a certain extent is already there, based on 3 existing pillars. The first one is the original work of the economist, the famous economist Keynes, and the so-called post-Keynesians. In economics, we are used to organizing in different schools, as it were, and the post-Keynesians are building on the original work of Keynes, focusing very much on the role of uncertainty in the work of Keynes. The second pillar is the work of the Austrians, neo-Austrians, von Mises and Hayek in particular, on praxeology. I'll come back to that later on, what it is, dispersed knowledge, markets and order, spontaneous or not. And then thirdly, tools from what I would call modern complexity theory as developed in the past 40 years or so with the Santa Fe Institute as a kind of starting point or a focal point. So what will I do in the remaining time that I have? I will focus first on lack of knowledge about the future, so uncertainty as I've called it. I will then discuss dispersion of knowledge and information, heterogeneity along several dimensions, complexity. And we'll then go into the features of the alternative paradigm, and if time permits, also list a number of research issues and initiative for spreading the message, as it were. So first about lack of knowledge. So the first pillar of the 3 pillars in the alternative paradigm. What I'm going to say about uncertainty and lack of knowledge is based on a work of Keynes published in 1921, which was his PhD thesis. It was about probability, so the work is called A Treatise on Probability. And the work of Frank Knight, another economist, also accidentally published in 1921, a book, Risk, Uncertainty and Profit. And although these works are not identical, in both works you can see that there is a distinction between risk and uncertainty. And in a situation of risk, in this context, we have a situation where all possible outcomes of a decision or an event or an action can be known. So the most simple example here is flipping a coin. You don't know whether it will be heads or tails, but you do know that it is one of these 2 possible outcomes. So you have a complete, exhaustive list of all possible outcomes. If that's the case, in this framework, you talk about a situation of risk. Implication of that is, if you are in a situation of risk, the probability calculus is applicable with all the sophisticated developments that we have seen in that area in economics. In such a situation, the decision making of an individual, an economic agent, can be modeled as a computable optimizing problem. And according to Keynes, this was assumed by the classical theory. And he argued in the 1930s against the classical theory, had the ambition to come up with an alternative theory, an alternative paradigm for economics, and he attacked the assumption of assuming risk in economic decision making. And I argue that today, if you look at the current mainstream economics across a broad range of different theories within that mainstream, still the underlying assumption about what an agent knows and what the economist himself knows is that there is this assumption of risk, a risky future, where we implicitly or sometimes even explicitly can list all the possible outcomes of certain decisions. However, logically, it is impossible to define and list all potential events in the future that may affect the outcome of today's decisions. Simply because people cannot know now what will be discovered in the future. Real novelty cannot be known now, by definition. It's logically inevitable. So that means, in the words of the biologist Kaufman, that the future is not pre-statable. You cannot have a complete list, an exhaustive list of all future possible outcomes. Another way to present that point is that the future phase space, or in physical terms, is not completely knowable now. And again, this is an inescapable part of the human condition. We cannot predict or cannot know the future advance of our own human mind and our own knowledge. and economic decisions and other decisions may be affected, the outcome of those decisions may be affected by what will happen and what will be discovered in the future. So this is particularly relevant for taking longer term decisions, for wealth and investment decisions as important examples. So economic agents cannot and do not make decisions fully rationally as defined and modeled in mainstream economics. So in mainstream economics, rationality means that you are acting as if you are solving a computable optimizing problem. But we cannot do that for the logical reason just pointed out. And the point is not that human agents are irrational, but that they cannot be rational as defined in mainstream economics. So this has therefore nothing to do with better education or providing more information. It has also nothing to do with, let's say, that people are irrational. The view here is that people are rational, in the sense that they are using their ratio in making decisions, but not in the way as assumed by mainstream economics. So that means that the traditional economic calculus under risk should be replaced with a theory of decision-making under uncertainty. And Keynes has provided elements for such a theory, and for Mises has proposed an alternative. The earlier mentioned praxeology, which basically is a theory of how human beings act. If it's under scarcity, then it's economics, but there are other areas where people act. The ambition of von Mises was to provide a general theory of human action. And in that theory, he did not assume that people have the type of knowledge that they are assumed to have in standard economics. Keynes has linked the existence of an uncertainty as defined earlier. So uncertainty is a situation where you are not able to list all the possible outcomes of an action. It may be a situation where you simply do not know or only have limited knowledge. Keynes has linked such a situation of uncertainty, which again I think is an inevitable condition, is an inevitable element of the human condition. Keynes has linked that existence of uncertainty and the role of money and finance in the economy. So as I said earlier, in the mainstream theory, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to give money and finance, strange how it may sound to a non-economist, a proper place in the theory and in explanations of what the economy in the end will deliver. So that with respect to uncertainty. So in the mainstream, we assume risks rather than uncertainty, but uncertainty is the inevitable condition of human existence. So let me move to the second element, the dispersion of knowledge, complexity. And there to explain that pillar, we have to go back to the 1930s, to Hayek in particular, but von Mises made similar points. And to really understand, let's say, the work of Hayek, I do not have the time to go too deeply in it. I refer to, I think, to two still very irrelevant articles. One article is Economics and Knowledge, and the other is The Use of Knowledge in Society. In the 1930s, we had the Great Depression. There was a lot of criticism of the capitalist system, of the market system, of decentralized economic decision making. And one of the debates that were raging in that context was the socialist calculation debate. And that debate, in which Hayek participated, strongly influenced his view of economics and the methodology of economics and what economics was all about. You had a socialist economist, Oskar Lange, who argued that central planning was efficient and that it was possible to calculate an efficient allocation of resources rather than leaving it to markets. But Hayek then came to realize that no economic agent, including a central planner, in a decentralized economy can possess all the information, all the data, all the knowledge that is assumed to be known in calculating an efficient allocation of resources. In the market system, he came to realize somehow this widely dispersed information and knowledge is used. And the economic equilibrium system, equilibrium is a very central concept in mainstream economics. I noted it this morning, it was also in some of the remarks, equilibrium, non-equilibrium, choosing equilibrium. But an equilibrium system is just a logical system. What it does, it shows that a set of prices exists such that the plans of all economic agents are consistent and can be executed unchanged. So equilibrium is a situation where all the individual plans of all the participants in the economy are consistent, where all the expectations of the future are consistent, so that everybody can move forward along the path that he has planned, he or she has planned. So the equilibrium system is just a logical system. It does not at all tell if and how an equilibrium will be established, whether an equilibrium will occur or not. So an equilibrium system in itself, again, is a logical system. It has no empirical content. And then Hayek initially argues, and that's important, that such empirical content can only come from understanding how people acquire knowledge and change expectation on that basis. So that you then can analyze if and how an equilibrium will be established. And that way of looking at the economic problem has not very much changed today. It's very similar to what is now being done in so-called disequilibrium economics. See, for example, work on heterogeneous expectations in financial markets, where expectations are formed according to behavioral finance insights. And what economists then try to do is to model how expectations change under the influence of the outcome of the economic process, and try to analyze if and whether such a system moves into the direction of an equilibrium. Now, the fascinating thing is that Hayek has left that path. So trying to find empirical content by trying to find out how people form expectations, gather knowledge, gather information, and how they change their information and how they change their expectations. Because he became convinced that a theory of learning and expectation formation is beyond reach. I have no time to elaborate on that, why he thought so, but that was what he concluded. And again, on logical grounds. So instead of trying to find a theory of expectations formation and changing expectations, he becomes fascinated by how economic agents do decide in practice, having only very limited and very local knowledge and information. And that's still, in spite of that very limited and dispersed information, if you look at the overall outcome of the economic process, that it is a rather structured outcome with continuous growth and development. So rather than being fascinated by the question of how is it possible that we have instability, he focuses on how is it possible that we have stability and growth at the same time. Certainly if you look back over the past 150 years, which is interesting because what I see nowadays, and understandably there's a lot of focus also in complexity science applied to economics on trying to show how the system can be unstable. Whereas the far more fascinating thing is that how can such a decentralized system have some structure and stability? And that's where the focus of Hayek was on. So where does that lead him? It leads him to focus on the role of prices and on a common set of rules in a broad sense. So rules including law, ethics, institutions, conventions. He also looked at the role of money and finance analyzed from that perspective. Money and prices as an important element of information that aggregates a lot of local information. And money that makes heterogeneity possible. Money that makes specialization possible. Money that in the end, and money and finance that in the end lead the economy, the society to become very complex because it leads, it makes diversity possible. This is very similar to the framework that Keynes used, an interesting relation also to that earlier mentioned work by von Mises on praxeology. So the economy, a financial system, a society is complex in the sense that not all information and knowledge that is present in the system can be known by one agent at one point in time. So that's the main defining characteristic in Hayek of what he later calls, in later work in the 60s, calls a complex social system. For him, the defining characteristic is the dispersion of information and knowledge, and dispersed in such a way that it is impossible to simply describe the state of the system at one point in time centrally by one agent. Still, as said, a complex system has a structure. It's not random. So these are the two first pillars, the two assumptions that we have to remove, as it were, from mainstream economics, which describes economic agents as making decisions under risk rather than uncertainty. Well, uncertainty is the inevitable human condition. And secondly, in mainstream economics, we assume that the system is simple rather than complex, and that we can, as it were, collect all the information as an economist, model the economy in its full detail. So what does the alternative paradigm look like? And I try to point out the broad features. Abandon the non-equilibrium lens through which an economist looks at the economy. Replace it by the lens of order. And what is order in this setup? Order is the set of types of outcomes, so abstract general patterns of the economic process. And order emerges from or is the result of purposefully acting and interacting agents under uncertainty on the basis of a common set of rules. Notice the the word purposefully. People act purposefully. So this is the broad definition of what order is. And in this new paradigm, this other paradigm, a major structuring element of society, of the economy, is order. And that's fundamentally different way of looking at a system than in a system where you look at it through the lens of equilibrium or non-equilibrium. For instance, correct expectations or fully coordinated plans are not required in the order concept. Order evolves. The time dimension is a critical lens in this other paradigm. And let me just give an example to make it a little bit more clear, hopefully. And the example is a competitive order. And I don't ask you to agree or whether, let's say, the competitive order, as I will now describe it, is correct or not correct, or is a right hypothesis or not. It's just showing a little bit, making a little bit more vividly what order is assumed to be. And a competitive order is based on, as all orders, on a set of rules, laws, of which property law is central, but for instance also bankruptcy law and a number of other rules of the game. And then from this competitive order rules, some patterns can be derived. And for instance, in a competitive order, you may argue that there is a drive for efficiency, that the law of one price holds, meaning that you pay the same price for the same product in the same location at the same time, and that there is a drive, there's a constant process of innovation and increasing productivity. So there is an underlying drive for growth. So these are the type of patterns that you can distinguish in an order, in this case a competitive order. Note that all these patterns, as I've described them here and given as an example, are independent of any process of information or expectation formation. It's simply not an element of the defining characteristics. So you don't need to know who has what expectations and how these expectations change to be able to describe these patterns. In this new alternative paradigm, detailed prediction and control are impossible. There's only one constant, that there's always the possibility of surprises, surprises in a positive sense, threats you may then call them, but also, in a negative sense, threats, but also in a positive sense, and then they are opportunities. These surprises define change. Change is a real novelty. It's something that could not be known before. And it makes time essential. The future in this new paradigm is imaginable, but not predictable, as said before. So expectations, imaginations of the future are exogenous. That is, if there are economists here, we do not assume rational expectations. The future, the view of the future is that the future emerges from the interaction of economic agents according to the rules in a broad sense. So very schematically, economic agents, people imagine the future, have a view about the future, act on the basis of that view, interact on the basis of that view, and together they form they shape the future, and the future emerges from that interaction. That's very different from, let's say, the view of the future in standard economics. In standard economics, basically the future objectively exists already now, or at least there are an exhaustive list of potential futures. And let's say what economic agents have to do is to discover what of the alternative potential outcomes will be the actual one. So the future in the mainstream paradigm is waiting to be discovered, as it were, whereas in this alternative paradigm, the future is being shaped by actions on the basis of imagination of that future. So expectations, is another way to put it, are drivers of future development rather than passive as in the mainstream, where they have to adjust to the actual objective underlying world. Order in the alternative paradigm emerges to a certain extent spontaneously without central direction. Self-organization plays a role. Then policy. I've mentioned here economic policy, but more generally in social policy, is about creating the right conditions or rules of the game, if you like, for certain patterns to arise. For example, you may want to have an order in which there is stability, in which there's growth, in which there's innovation, in which there's peace, or not to arise. So the opposite of the elements that I just mentioned. How does modern complexity theory fit into this paradigm? I think the first two pillars that I've discussed so far are basically providing a theory of human action in an uncertain, complex world. What modern complexity theory provides, in addition to that, is a language, mainly a language to describe an evolving economic, social order and actual patterns within that order. So you can think about nonlinear dynamics, graph theory, evolutionary dynamics, and a lot of other tools. So the macro pattern, the outcome at the economic-wide level or the society-wide level emerges in this paradigm from micro behavior and interaction. And indeed, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. That's the idea of emergence. In economics, this idea was introduced in the 1930s. It was called, again by Keynes, the fallacy of composition. If you think that macro is just aggregated micro. And again, today in mainstream economics, that is still the case. Macro is aggregated micro. Very often so-called representative agents are assumed. So that if you have a representative consumer and you can explain the behavior of the representative consumer, you at the same time explain aggregate consumption. It's not true in the alternative paradigm. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. The fact that economic agents interact, create laws at and outcomes at a higher level. So micro decisions are made in a framework of rules for interaction. So you can see, again, trying to develop a lens. You can see the economic process through the lens of an evolving game, cooperative game, in which not all outcomes can be known at any moment. So it's not a traditional game theory as we know it. It is game theory which assumes uncertainty, which assumes complexity. So the interesting thing then is that micro behavior has a macro foundation. You cannot operate as an economic agent in isolation. You need to know some of the macro aspects, some of the rules of the game. So the interesting thing is that in economics, there has been a lot of debate, and still is a lot of debate, about the so-called micro foundation of macroeconomics. So that you have to try to link the theory about individual behavior with the theory of macro behavior. The way that has been done is basically by what I told earlier, by assuming that you can have representative agents, and so that you can aggregate individual behavior to behavior of the system as a whole. This alternative paradigm also, in a way, unifies economic theory, and it has the potential, I think, to unify the social sciences, and perhaps, I must be far more cautious here, parts of evolutionary biology. So let me finally say a few words about research that I think can be done in the context of this new paradigm. I think there's a lot of fruitful research topics, both very conceptually, methodologically, theoretically, but also there are a lot of applications to very concrete issues, also policy issues. And let me just mention a number without in any way having the ambition to be exhaustive, because if you buy my argument that this is another way of looking at the economy, you can pick any economic topic and look at it through this lens, through this paradigm. But let me just mention a couple of them. The supervision of the financial sector, both micro and macro, with many sub-questions. Let me make that a little bit more concrete. The question of what kind of capital regulation for financial institutions should you have? Perhaps you know that there is the so-called Basel framework, which is very much risk-based. Well, I've just argued that economics is in the end not about risk, but about uncertainty. That has implications for your supervisory framework. There are a lot of discussions about changing the structure of the financial system. For instance, should you cap the size of banks? Should you make a distinction between investment banks and retail banks? Should you have central clearing of certain financial products? All these questions and many more, I think, can be very fruitfully analyzed through the lens of this paradigm. I briefly mentioned the great financial expansion, the enormous growth of the financial system relative to the real economy since the 1970s. How to explain that? I think that it is a question that is underexplored in the mainstream, and underexplored as a potential cause, or at least an element in explaining why we had this financial crisis in 2007, 2008, related to questions of monetary policy. Data collection. I argue that complex system means that you cannot know everything. So what does that mean for the data that you do want to collect, and how you want to manage the data? Questions around innovation and growth, sustainability. Structural policies with respect to the financial sector I already mentioned. A very interesting one is the role of norms in economic policy. In the standard theory, it's very difficult to find a proper role for norms. And you see that a lot of criticisms for actual norms in economic policy is that they cannot be rationally derived from an optimization problem. Here it is different. I will not go into that. More conceptual issues: can the views of knowledge of Keynes, Hayek, and von Mises be synthesized, and if so, how? The consequences for the methodology, of the social sciences, basically meaning further articulating and developing the alternative paradigm. Because as said, I think that there is a kind of a at least rudimentary and a little bit more than rudimentary framework, but certainly more can be done also in relation to the hard sciences. Finally, I'd like to just mention that part of this work is now being done in a small company that's called Glocomnet. That's a kind of a network that I try to build with a couple of people to promote awareness, research, education, also consultancy in the context of social complexity and uncertainty. And I've mentioned here the address of that. Thank you very much, and I hope that I stayed within the 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Lex. Quick check, how did that last process work in terms of having your quick conversation, putting your questions up? Was that better than sticking up your hands? Yeah?
It was interactive. Great table, great discussion table. I would like to interact more with the people.
Okay. How do the rest of you feel?
Same
difference?
questions.
Say again?
There were too many questions at the end.
Yeah, okay.
If there were fewer, it probably would work better.
Okay, well, why don't we try that? Who's got some questions? Yes, do we have a microphone or we just maybe you can just shout?
I'm fine with shouting. Yeah, first off, I'm really fascinated because this kind of approach is sort of like a dream come true for me because I've sort of had this idea of Hayek from Mises and Keynes working actually in a very similar way on complexity, but expressing it differently, and they were kind of pitted against each other. So I think it's really nice to sort of try and synthesize this. So that's the first remark. I think it's really relevant and very important to actually go there. And it totally relates to complexity theory. Now in terms of questions, well, there's a lot of possibilities. One of the things actually, what's your opinion in terms of sort of uncertainty and finance? Because you haven't actually gone into sort of the detail on this. But finance is often seen as a maturity transformation process, basically. And that really has to do a lot with uncertainty and risk. So that would be question number one.
Maybe just stay there. Okay, that's the first question. There's a lot of other questions and you had quite a
Maybe
bit
I
of
answer
time.
this
Yeah.
one, otherwise
Yeah, and then
I
we'll
tell
move
you
on.
to
Yes, please.
don't forget that I think it's a very interesting and relevant question. And without speaking too long about it, I do think it has deep implications for finance theory. In short, finance is indeed also based on the idea that financial system and financial processes are risky rather than uncertain. That has led to, for instance, that has led to a framework in which you look at the world in trying to balance, on the one hand, risk and on the other hand, return. It has also led to that capital framework in which you try to hold a buffer against risk. If you look at it from the aspect of uncertainty, then basically you have to make a distinction between, on the one hand, risk, which basically in the end is just variability of potential outcomes. And if you have just variability of outcomes, that can be priced. Can simply be priced. So there's no reason to hold capital against risk. The only reason to hold capital is because you are uncertain. So this means for the investment process, it means a lot, and it also means a lot for supervision of the system. And let me not go further than that, because otherwise I probably overrun. And
Sounds like a whole new lecture there on its own.
it's a topic on its own, and I have some presentations on that as well. But
Yeah, Gina.
Can you explain why the Chinese thought they could control their markets and seem to be? Could you explain why the Chinese seem to think or thought they could control their markets and why they are struggling with this recent plunge and the loss of $3 trillion so quickly?
that's, of course, a very challenging question, because I have no inside information about what the Chinese actually think about this market process that we see at the moment. But it's amazing, if you look at it from my perspective, how much we pretend to know about such a complex thing as an economy. Financial markets, but also the real markets of the economy. And let's say, I said one of the foundations behind this paradigm comes from people like Hayek, who made this point when he received the Nobel Prize, and he gave a lecture called "The Pretense of Knowledge," in which he explained this, and he also had some other work where he says what we are as economists, except from the fact that we have made a mess of things, we are constructivists. And constructivists are people who think that they can really, let's say, design the system as they like. And I think a lot of that constructivist thinking is in the current paradigm. For instance, one other example is that many central banks, but for example, the European Central Bank, have an objective for inflation. So the general rise of prices, and that's in the ECB's case, that's 2%, a little bit below 2%. It's an enormous pretense that you think you can steer inflation to such a precise level with having only a very tiny instrument, and that is the interest that you ask from banks for your credit. So there is an enormous belief in being able to know the system, to being able to influence the system. And it may well be that, let's say, the Chinese are more influenced by this mainstream thinking than you might think coming from another economic system, because it is, unless indeed you destroy market functioning. That's basically what they are doing to a certain extent. It is impossible to steer such a market in detail. That's what they are finding out at the moment, I think.
Looks like they'll maybe have the same success as Norman Lamont when he tried to manage the currency in England and the market.
It happens all over again, all over and over again.
Yes, gentleman over here.
I'd like to go back to your definition of order as something that emerges when agents act purposefully under a common set of rules and under a state of uncertainty. Two immediate questions arise. One is, what happens when different regimes with different rule sets interact and intersect and overlap with each other? Secondly,
So may I ask, answer this one, because otherwise, because this is this is a very deep and difficult question, and I don't pretend to have a complete answer. And I think it's a very relevant one if you try to look at the world as a whole and discuss some of the issues that we discussed previous discussion of global governance. I think that it depends on whether, in the end, you have an overarching system of more abstract rules for interaction between different, more precise regimes. And that's the type of global governance, perhaps, that you're looking for. if you do not have such a overarching order, then there are a couple of alternatives. Basically, perhaps are you could see as order themselves. The first is peaceful coexistence. You just neglect each other, but there's peaceful coexistence or conflict.
I was wondering if Sean, you had a comment, because the question you've asked, this very interesting question about it's great,
Yep.
but if you have completely different views, how do you square it? If Sean, you had a comment on that particular question, but also you had a question as well, so we're going to kill two birds with one, Sean.
Super. Thanks very much. As long as nobody throws me against the wall or something. First of all, I think the pretense of knowledge concept in respect of this is enormously important. But the problem about pretense of knowledge is that it also makes it very difficult to assert sufficient knowledge to enable rulemaking. And in other words, you have to believe that if you are seeking to create certain conditions of order that you perceive to be desirable, that you as a policymaker have some knowledge about what instruments would in fact predispose toward those outcomes. Now, in today's world, the problem that you've very correctly described can actually be taken one step further, because if you think of the different sets of rules imposed by the Federal Reserve and the SEC in the United States, by the ECB and the BIS in the European space, by the Bank of England in the English space, and then you think about global financial institutions with operations in each one of those spaces and others operating on a continuing basis, then this conflict of rules seems to be very profound. If I can just tag a question onto that, I mean, comment to that, please, but a question onto it. Firstly, how does one think about the utility or otherwise of high-frequency algorithmic trading in the middle of this? Because that isn't even informed by continuous learning, except in a completely different way to the rather more normative framework in which you've been expressing it. And then my other question would be, how do you relate this? But it's the same question, as you recognize, is how do you relate your overall account to Soros's reflexivity within this particular?
I think I take the second one, because that's the more general question. And I make two points. First, on the pretense of knowledge point, and your point that you need some information in choosing the right roles. And I think that is true. But there's one element that I didn't emphasize as much in the presentation that I'd like to mention here in responding to you. That is that in the constructivist approach, indeed, you have the ambition, the pretense that you can redesign the economy, the social system from scratch, just by optimizing the system. So you can have a blueprint. You can construct a better world, as it were. The pretense of mainstream economics is that you have the knowledge to do that. In this non-constructivist approach, you're far closer to what Popper in his philosophy argued, that the only rational policy making can starting from what has emerged already. And that embodies a lot of knowledge that nobody has in full. So the only rational policy is to start from where you are and do piecemeal engineering. Not changing all the rules at once, but one by one, as it were, and then learn from what happens, but because there will always be unintended consequences. So policy making is a dynamic process. It's not just an optimizing problem to start with. Then the reflexivity of Soros, I think that idea comes very close, if it is not identical, to basically the views of Keynes earlier. Because the idea is that the expectations that people have shape the system. That's exactly what I draw from the uncertainty concept by Keynes. So I think they're very close. I think Soros himself bases his arguments more on rather on Popper than Keynes. But I think this is great similarity. One final thing that was not asked, but looking how it relates to other approaches. You have the work of Taleb, focusing on black swans. I must say that black swans can be described, I would say, in the mainstream paradigm, because it's, to a large extent, means that you have distributions, but they have fatter tails than in the normal distribution that's often used in economics. That's less fundamental, in my view, than the ideas about uncertainty, reflexivity, and other concepts.
Time for one or two more questions. Yes, while the microphone goes to the back, just to this issue of aligned rules. Tomorrow in my talk, I'll be also maybe giving another view saying that a complex system actually needs misaligned rules to work well. So this is we will be adding as we go through. Did you get the mic? Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it. So I want to say something which may come across as slightly provocative, but I don't mean to be provocative. I used to be in academia, and I left academia to work with companies. And one thing that I noticed is that when I'm talking with CEOs about, here's what you should do, they don't have the academic mindset of what is the truth of the situation, but give me a lever. Just give me a lever, tell me which direction to push it, and stop talking about the truth of your wonderful model, which me and my colleagues constructed. And so I kind of wonder whether the search for a paradigm that somehow seems to capture the complexity is going to be challenged in terms of whether politicians and the people who want to make decisions will kind of be willing to grasp the structure of kind of a new way of envisioning the economy, modeling the economy. But and I want to propose that maybe an idea of saying, well, there are the neoclassical economic paradigm basically is silent on making decisions along a whole bunch of directions, like, for example, high-frequency trading, which Sean mentioned. And rather, what about thinking of saying, well, here's another direction which the previous paradigm hasn't made any statement about, and we can build a model that at least says it's better to move in this direction than in that direction. So, questions like, would it be better to regulate high-frequency trading, or would it be better to encourage more of it? In a sense, that's kind of a more contained question, and if you could just kind of come up with a definitive answer that was supported by, data or had some ring of predictability, which, of course, people making decisions want to see. I propose that might be a useful way, but I mean that feels a bit different. I mean, yeah.
Briefly, reaction, Ross?
Yeah, you found the question provocative. I don't find it provocative at all. Perhaps my answer will be found provocative by you. Because you said at the end, there are a lot of things I could elaborate, but I will not do so. But let me pick up one point in the end where you said that decision makers wants to have predictability. And that's exactly the problem. What we have to show them is that it is beyond reach, and that we have that policy making cannot be based on objective predictability. Let me end again with a quote by again Hayek this time, who said that the most important task of economists, of economics as a science, is to all the time point out how little we can know about a system that we want to intervene with in a very great detail. And I think that's what we have to convey, and then it means, as a consequence of that, and I've tried to give let's say a sketch of that only. It means that policy making cannot be based, should not be dependent on being able to predict in very great detail.
Thank you very much, Lex. And it's now time for lunch, but before we break for lunch, please a round of applause for Lex. Very soon, Lex.